This is a video tutorial on how to use Animation Studio's Advanced Skeleton Auto Rigging System, our Advanced Modular Rigging System. I gave a workshop on this at DePaul University on Friday, what day was it? Friday the 13th, I guess I should remember that. This is just a quicker version of that same thing to keep things moving a little faster, since at the workshop it was a little bit of back and forth, so I want to make this a little bit more efficient for those of you who want to learn how to use the system. It's a fantastic system published by the Animation Studios, or Animation Studios. You can go to their website here, animationstudios.com.au. Here's the plugin, essentially the plugin for Maya. It's a Mel script. You can download it here for free if you're a student or an independent user, basically anyone not making money off of it. And if you need to make money off of it, you can purchase it for really cheap. So it's extremely reasonable. There's also a website here. If you go to Facebook, there's tons of videos on how to actually use the rigging system. You can scroll through here. Part of the reason why I'm making this video is because while there's lots of videos on the Facebook page, they're really fast. It took me a little bit of playing around to get everything to work just right. So I want to kind of help all of you avoid some of the issues I did, but also promote it because it's been such a great tool for me. And I know for students, this can be a lifesaver. Can really get you working in your production quickly and not get you bogged down with rigging. One of the best things about this whole system that I really like is that, aside from it being free for students, which is such a huge help, is it's actually one of the best auto riggers I've ever used, regardless of cost. It has a facial rigging system, which most of them do not. They're just body rigs. It's incredibly flexible, as you'll note from what it says right here. You can create rigs with unlimited body configurations, 3 heads, 5 legs, 100 fingers, anything goes. This is totally true. Again, it takes a little bit of getting used to if you're doing anything above and beyond the norm, but it's extremely flexible. I find that the creator, whose name I cannot find, which is too bad because I would love to give him props, clearly is making this for the user, the independent user who wants to be creative and do their own thing and not just pump out the same old everyday biped. Although if you want to do that, you're fine with that. It's fine with that too. So it's just an incredibly flexible system. The other thing that I really like about it is it allows you to create a rig, test it, and if you don't like it, to make changes really fast, which you can't do on your own if you just rigged it yourself. And I've never seen any of the system allow you to do it in this manner, which is really fantastic. So, and I'll surely be showing you that that part of the system as well. It's also very fast, easy to install. You can install it just about anywhere with just a drag and drop. It's just really great, and again allows infinite configurability. Sorry about the screaming in the background. My 2.5-year-old has expressing himself. Not sure what's going on there. So just a really great system. Again, back to their website, there's a download button right there. And if you click on right here, there's a bunch of free character rigs you can use to test out the system, including a new version of Max or Maya with the advanced skeleton rig in there. All these are available for your use for projects, again, as long as you're not making money, but great for playing around in practice. The one that we're going to be working with today is taken from here, which is called the Tuna rig. I've basically reconfigured it a little bit for a better facial rig, but it's ultimately the same model, so you can play with it there as well, a finished version. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. The files that I associated with this tutorial, which are available online for you to download. Let me grab them right here. Let's see. We just have the tuna mesh rig, our tuna mesh geometry, which we'll be working with. The advanced skeleton folder, which I downloaded from their website, which includes notes on how to install it, as well as the most important one, the install.ml, which is how you actually install it on your computer. Let's begin with that one. I already have it installed on mine, as well as the file opened up, but I'll show you how this works. If you're installing it for the first time, it's as simple as you just need to open up a custom shelf or a new shelf. You can go to File, New Shelf, name it. I'll call mine a a skeleton, because I already have an advanced skeleton shelf up here. So it creates a new shelf, and then you literally just drag your install.ml into the window, let go, and it'll pop up here right away. Make sure that after you've done that, you choose Save All Shelves. Otherwise, next time you open up Maya, you'll have to reinstall it. But since installing it takes about 5 seconds, not a big deal. At the workshop, a lot of people had trouble getting it to show up, and it was because they hadn't unzipped the file. So when you download the package that I sent to you guys online, it's going to be this one zip file. You have to unzip this, and inside that zip file, I'll probably fix it for when I put it back on there, but double check. There was another zip file in it. You have to unzip all those before any of this will work. You can't actually run a zip file. You have to always unzip it first, even though you can look through it. So keep that in mind. I guess I can shrink that down. So once you get it up and running, you want to make sure you're on your new shelf. Hit this 5 button right here, which will pop open the advanced skeleton controls over here on the left side of Maya. If you want, there's an undock button here you can click on if you want to put this, if you're working on a dual monitor setup. For now, I'm just going to leave it docked. You can also check for updates and update through the actual plugin. It's really well set up. I should mention before we jump into it, there are a few downsides to the system, but again, better than any system I have used to date. So there are some bugs in it that I've run into. If you don't do things the way it wants you to do, it can crash it. So I do recommend, not crash it, but it'll just not function. And then often that means kind of going back to a previous save version. And because of that, I recommend that you save out many versions as you go, just so you don't have to go back and do your work. But I'd also mention it's more flexible in that way than any other system I've used. Most of them, you have to, once you start going through the controls and the options, you can't stop. And in this one, you can stop at any point, save it out, and just start back from there, the same position you finished at later, which is really, really great. So just be prepared. It's not perfect. I might also say if you do run into bugs, you can, through the Facebook page, email the guy that made it, and he will respond almost immediately. He's great. So I've had really great luck in that regard. I'd also say the body rigging system is pretty solid. I haven't run into issues with that. It's sometimes going to be hard to figure out what you need to do. All the documentation is built into the system, so you'll see these little question marks here, and these question marks pop up these windows, which tell you what you should be doing. They're great for the most part, but sometimes there's a little bit that I don't know, and it kind of comes down to a little bit of trial and error to figure out exactly what you should be doing or what you should be doing to get the best results. Again, part of the reason why I'm doing this tutorial. The other downside, which I haven't figured out a way around yet, is that the body rig works best on a symmetrical body, but it doesn't have to be. If you want to do an asymmetrical body, it just means more time spent getting it just right. The facial rig, however, in this case I have the facial, the facial part separate from the body, I have found really doesn't work without a symmetrical face, which is too bad. I hope at some point he implements an asymmetrical face rigger. I'll certainly suggest it. Since most great sculpts are asymmetrical, you can at this point, you could add in a blend shape afterwards to make the face asymmetrical, which I'll, if I have time, I'll demonstrate. But ultimately at this point, if your face is not symmetrical, it'll give you issues. I've also found that you need to, even though he says you do not need to include all the required face parts. In this case, let me close these things up. Sorry, it remembers at your last position, which includes the right eye, left eye, face, tongue, and teeth. I found, even though these are technically optional, I found if you don't include them, the facial rig, at least in my last version, got upset and wouldn't work. But not hard. You can even put in a fake teeth and tongue, just a placeholder. It'll still work as long as it has something to connect to. All right. So aside from that, though, it really is a fantastic system. I think a lot of you will get some great use out of it. The fact that once you get comfortable with it, you could rig an entire body and do facial controls in likely under 30 minutes is really great. My guess is if you're really fast at it, you could even do it faster than that, but it takes a little practice. So because I'll be talking through it, it'll probably be a good hour is my guess. But hopefully we'll get through it a little faster if I can keep myself moving. So let's see. Let me do a quick overview of the controls that we're looking at. We're going to be just focusing on the body right now. So the body section, we're going to be focusing on the body for the first part of this. The face I'll do as a separate video, but it'll just be connected to this if you want to watch them back to back. The pre-section just gets your model ready to go. There are some tools in here just to you can create a selection and a UI, a user interface that you can pop up through a window here. Plus there's this cool plugin, this poser designer, which allows you to save out poses, and a walk designer, which allows you to do quick setup walks really quickly. It's actually a lot of fun to use, but actually a great way to test the rig and make sure things are working well. And then a few options here, actually no options, necessities, when you're getting ready to finish the rig off for changing display options, optimizing the rig, and finally publishing it. And then under the demo section, you can download different rigs here from online and play with them. So these are all the rigs that they have available. You can actually open these up and go ahead and play with them. So, and then of course the about section, which I showed before, to update and undock the whole system. All right. So we're going to jump into rigging tuna. I'm definitely going to have my outliner open through this whole operation. It's the best way to be able to select things quickly. It makes it much faster work when working with the advanced skeleton window. So I'll be going back and forth using this button over here to make my outliner visible and not visible. I'll also be using my perspective window plus my four-port view to do a lot of my operations here. So without further ado, here we go. If you go to the pre-section, there's a few buttons here. For the most part, these windows work by just starting on the first button and working your way down. So here we go. The first thing we're going to need to do is clean the model. A good model, even on your own, you should do some cleaning before you even bring it in here is my recommendation. A good model, you'd want to have your everything named. So you can see over here, everything is named carefully, right and left. I have the head grouped under a separate section here, which makes it a little bit easier to find things. Not necessary, but nice. But everything named nicely. You also notice as I click on the mesh, everything is zeroed out, which is really important. And there's no history, and that's vital. If you have history on anything in your model, rigging on any way, auto rigging or regular rigging, will completely will still stop working right away. So you have to have everything cleaned up that way. Just to show you how to do it yourself, you can also use a system. Obviously, naming, you can just put things over here in the outliner, double click, and name them, or do it over here in the channel box. Over here to delete history, we go to, first we should freeze transformations. So modify freeze transformations will zero everything out. It will turn your rotates and translates to 0, your scales to 1, and visibility to on. And then we would go to edit, delete by type, and history, and that will get rid of any history and all the things we have selected. Notice that I selected everything over here in the outliner. Sometimes when you're selecting things over here, you'll just get the top node as opposed to actually all the individual points of mesh. So we want to get everything here. Now to start, you'll see it says group your model so that you have one top node and name this group Geo. Then use the model or cleanup tool or cleaner tool. This is absolutely required. So you select everything. I'm going to try, actually, I have these eye locators here, which will help us later on find the center of the center of the eyes. I'm going to go ahead and group those in here as if they're geometry, and hopefully this will work out. So call this Geo as required. I'll choose model clean. We don't need to create the top node, we already did it. So I'll just hit the clean button. It gives me a warning that I'm not using Arnold, which is fine. It looks like it ripped out my head group. So I reloaded in Tuna, the original mesh. This actually, I was going to clean this up and just take that error out, but it's actually good to start off this way and show you that you do have to stick to the plan of Advanced Skeleton. If you try to do your own thing, often it'll, because the plugin is looking for specific things in the outliner, if it finds something it doesn't expect, it can cause it to not work. So in this case, my grouping the eye locators in there caused it to run into an error. So just note, if you do things your own way or try to kind of rig as you go with tools that you know, it might mess up the system. So in this case, if I do it the way it tells me to, that's the good thing. If you do things the way it tells you to, it will work correctly. So here, if I select my original geometry and hit Geo, just like it told me to, and do the model cleanup and clean, everything works just fine. You'll notice it got rid of those locators that I put in there. It did not like them. I'm going to import them later to use them again and then get rid of them, so it should still not be an issue. And I'll make those locators available for those of you who want to try this out and make the eyes a little bit easier to do. So good lesson. Stick to the plan that it is described here, and you'll have the better results. If you try to do your own thing, make sure to save first before you try it out, just in case something goes wrong. You can always go back and start again from your last step. Not a problem, and actually, again, a great benefit for the software. At this point, I'll hit the next button. Again, just keep going down the line. I'll hit New Scene. Oh, it'll ask me to save changes. It's probably a good idea to save your changes into a new file. This will work fine though for right now. All right, and now I choose reference. It already knows. I'm sorry, it's going to ask you for the name of the file. So here it's Tuna Mesh. If you want to, I could just make a new copy of this just to be safe. Call it working or cleaned, probably be smarter. So I'll choose that one, open, and now we're ready to go. So you'll notice that when it's referenced in here, it creates a layer that's templated. So if you hit the T, it'll go to R, which allows you to see it but not select it. If you have this off, you can select the geometry, which in this case is going to work against you, and then template mode, which is just the wireframe, which is nice, allows us to see through it. Some of you might prefer to actually work with the reference mode, but go to X-ray so you can see through it this way. I'll start out with template mode. I tend to prefer that. All right, so we can now go over to the body section. Oh, by the way, for those of you who are unfamiliar with referencing, referencing is just a matter of creating a link to another file instead of importing stuff into it. So you'll notice there's this little blue dot next to where it says Model Geo. That means that everything in this folder or in this little group is not actually in the file. It's just linked to from another file. The advantage of this is I can only do so much of this before it will stop me. It keeps me from breaking the original geometry or doing anything too nasty to it. Later on, when we finish the rig, it'll create a file that we will reference into our animations, and that will keep your animators from breaking the rig, which is how all productions I've ever worked on function. It also allows you to make changes to the rig or changes to the model and automatically update all your animations. You will see over here under File, Reference Editor, you'll see this is the file that we're referencing. You can always unclick it to unreference it. You can always right-click and reference, reload reference, or create a new reference, replace the reference. It's actually a really great system. If you need to make a new reference yourself, you can always just click on Create Reference this way as well. All right, so we're done with the pre-section. It's clean and ready to go. And now we can go ahead and start building. Now, even though we haven't done much, I'm going to go ahead and save this out as my first step, just so I don't have to go back and do any of that setup. So I'll call this tuna mesh rig, body rig, since we're going to do a facial rig later, body rig 01. And as I go through it, if I do something I want to save, I'll just save it as 02, 03, and increment that all the way through. The sections that we're looking at through here are fit, which is to get the initial skeleton in here. That takes the most time. And then build, which actually build the skeleton. You have multiple options for creating skinning, which is the deform section. The geometry section allows you to make a low-res skeleton, low-res mesh as well, so that if you have a very dense mesh, which is slow to animate with, you can have your animator switch over to a low-res version and animate at full speed. There's also options here for motion capture rigs, game skeleton rigs, which I haven't used. I think they're Unreal. This is an Unreal-based skeleton rig, which is great. The control curve section allows you later on to replace the controls in the character. And then the control mesh, actually I should talk about these later on when we're closing in and finishing. So let's just stick to the fit. There's lots of options in here. I'm not going to go through all of them. That's something you can do online. I want to go through the basic operation of creating a biped rig. Right up here, you can basically import skeleton templates. This allows you to do a biped, a bendy biped, a game biped. You can read the rest of these, but it kind of gives you a starting place to work with. You can also make your own and save them in here. For right now, we're just going to do the basic biped. I'm going to import it. It already comes with the great foot rig, so the extra limbs here are if you have extra feet or hands or something, you can add these in, and it will immediately add in a rig that you can then connect to. So that's kind of nice. That's actually really nice too. And once you make your changes, you can export, and that's where you get to save out your new configuration. So here we are with the basic rig. It's just on one side of the body. What we're going to do is place one side, and when we're done, it'll automatically mirror it over, which is great. If you haven't done any rigging before, it's good to note the best way to rig is using orthographic views, the front, side, and top view, and use your perspective. If you're going to be in here, the best thing to be doing is making sure that you're using the arrows here to keep things on the axis. You'll also note, and I didn't do this here, that for your geometry, for good bending, you want enough geometry on your rig. I guess I should have mentioned this before. You want enough geometry that you can get some nice bends. If you don't have enough geometry on the knees, no matter how good the rigging system is, you'll get poor bends around the knees, the hips, the elbows, etc. I forgot to also mention, you'll notice my character is smack in the middle of the grid. That's not by chance. That's where you want to rig from. Especially when you do flipping operations, like when we duplicate all the hands and everything across the bones. It'll work best when the character is symmetrical. I didn't mention it, but also really important is you want your feet to be flat on the ground, or as flat as you possibly can. You'll note that if I zoom way in here, the toe is actually off the grid, as is the heel, which will create some weirdness when we do the final the final rig. You want generally when the animator zeroes out the foot, for the animator to be able to comfortably assume the foot is flat on the ground plane. So even this little bit of change here from front to back would actually cause some issues, which I'll actually leave like this and demonstrate. So it's easy enough to flatten that foot out and not have these issues later on. All right, so so I'll switch back over to template mode and get ready to place my skeleton. Now, as I was getting ready to say, when you're working with a rig, if you haven't done this before, the best thing you can do is just translate joints. So if you click on a joint, which you can just do by a drag box to the middle of it, you don't have to click right on this circle. That becomes kind of annoying and slow to do. You can also, once you've selected a joint, they're all in a hierarchy. You can use the up and down arrow key to jump through them, which makes things a little faster too. The regular translate will allow you to move joints around, which is the best way to place a joint. Use my undo key to move that back. You can also, if you're in the move tool, select a joint and press insert. You'll see it gives you this box, and you can move just that joint by itself. Now I have my settings. I'll give you a little tip here. I have my settings in Maya. If you go to Window, Settings and Preferences, and then over here in your manipulator section, where is that manipulator? Oh, up here. I have the move, rotate, scale, tool switch, and selection change set to reset to view plane handle on both of these. And what that does is whenever I select anything, it never remembers where it used to be, which means it's at the default selection, no arrow is highlighted, which means at any point I can middle mouse click on any part of the window and select this without being directly on it, which seems like a small thing, but when you get to this controller here, it's often easy when you're trying to grab from the middle. It's easy to select a bunch of other things, and it's much easier for it to default to grabbing the middle, and then I can just middle mouse click without ever having to click on it, especially since most of the time I'm just going to be translating freehand. Which you should only be doing if you're in an orthographic view. If you translate freehand in the perspective view, this could be bad news because you're actually moving on all three axes at the same time, which you can see up here. But in the orthographic views, you're only ever moving on two axes at once, despite what it says here. It's probably because I'm in object mode. Yeah. Well, it doesn't seem to matter. That is odd. Oh, because we're in the joint space, so that's always going to be a little bit different. I'm assuming that's what's going on. But either way, you can safely middle mouse click and drag here, and you know you're just moving on that one plane, which is good. All right. So at this point, we can start placing things. If you do have to rotate a joint, it's okay, but something to avoid if you don't have to do it. Scaling is something to be avoided. We've ran into some issues with that in the workshop, so I'd avoid scaling anything if you have to. If you want to make a joint be bigger, grab it and make it bigger this way. In general, the more you understand anatomy and where bones actually reside in the human body or in an animal body, the better the movement you'll end up with. The great news, if you mess up, you can easily go back and fix it later with the advanced skeleton system. But you will find, because characters are often dramatized or abstracted, that ultimately there is no perfect real-life anatomy equivalent for some characters or for some bones. And for those, when you're unsure, the best thing to do is keep it to the middle. So in this case, the middle of the leg is going to give me a better representation, despite the fact that a real hip actually is more over to the side and then comes over. If you do that with with Maya, a Maya rigging system, you end up with some really strange movements, some really strange rotations. Things you can fix out if you know what you're doing, but in an auto rigging system, better to average things out a little bit. So you'll often see me cheating towards the middle of the mesh to get better results. Okay, the first thing you need to do is set the position of your root. This is the center of your characters, of all your characters' movement, and generally the root goes right here at the right around the belly button, kind of at the center of the hip line. So right about here is normal. You can keep it a little bit lower if you want. Definitely don't go too high, and also make sure from a side view that we're also in the middle of the mesh. So I'm thinking about where the back's going to end up later, and that's actually pretty decent. Again, I'm going to be changing all these things, but that's pretty close right there. You'll find that some joints are easier to place from the side than from the front. That's totally fine. So in this case, you'll see it's kind of hard to see where the knee is, but if you look from the side here, it's very obvious that the knee is right there. So I'm just going to grab this and move it to right there. Actually, I don't I don't really care if it's right on the geometry on the inside. We'll never see that, at least in my for what I have planned. So that probably doesn't matter. Double check that it looks good from the front, which it does. Now you'll note here, I was about to say you'll note that it's a nice straight line, and I'll see right now that it's not. You do want to try to keep your joints in any IK system planar, so this leg will end up being an IK leg. Same thing with the arm. And by planar, what I mean is I don't want to move this joint way out so we have an angle here, but then also have it out on an angle here, and then have this on a different rotation like this. Now what we see is there's no one plane that I can put through all this. I can't draw a straight line through these things. So you'll notice that this system of joints is on this plane, and the foot is on this plane. That's multiplanar, and ultimately is going to create some really bad results. So the best thing you do, you can rotate this whole system out like this. You can rotate it in, although it's nicer to keep it straight for your animators. As long as it's all in one plane, it'll operate normally. And if you make a mistake, again, you can go back and fix it, but nicer to not have to. If you do, like if you note here how it's not straight anymore, you can always use the grid. Oh, actually you can snap to grid to make sure this is actually a perfect straight line, which is a nice trick. And I'll put it back here. I think when I was showing you guys the hips, I got it a little bit off. So again, I'm going to try to line it up here with the knee. And then I can move the hips separately. I'm going to really work just on moving it up and down so it's still right above the knee. Your hips, if you feel for that kind of bone in your hips, that's the top of your hip bone right here, and you can see that your leg actually is hinging from right in here, which actually is somewhat, even though the bone is over to the side, which it is still over the knee. Although the fact that the bone is to the side does create a different kind of movement than if it was straight. But for our purposes, we're basically looking for where that hip bone would be, and then coming down just a little bit and above the crotch. So somewhere kind of right in between that line is about where we're going to get good movement. But again, for every character, you're going to have to play a little bit to see what works best and the type of movement you want for your character. So in this case, I'm not too far off. I'm probably a little bit high. So I'm going to pull down, use the insert mode so it's just the hip, and pull down. I picture his hip bone being right about here where it protrudes, and kind of in between there and the crotch, right about there. I guess I should say groin, not crotch. And this might be a little bit high as well. So again, insert mode, and I'll pull that down just a little bit. All right, so the knee is placed. I should note that it's okay if you move this knee in and out as necessary, because as long as you're straight up and down in the other view, you will be planar. In this case, I have a little bit of bend there, not much. Ooh, I'm also not on the knee. So here, I'll freehand place it right there. If you do have a character that has a leg at an angle, also not a big deal. Usually what I do is set it up so it's close, rotate it out, and as I make changes here, I'll use object mode to make sure that I can move directly in line with the joint system and keep things planar. The hotkey for that is if you hold in W for translate, holding your left mouse button, you can get this pop-up menu which allows you to switch from world to object mode as necessary. So actually I'll stay in object mode for right now. All right, so the ankle, if you feel that nub on your ankle, that protrusion on the outside, that's about where your ankle hinges from. So looking at trying to get the right placement, I tend to find this is a little bit easier from a side view. So I'm just going to place the entire foot. So right about here, we'll give a nice rotation. These guys here, you don't want to do anatomically correct. The toe end literally goes right on the end of the toe. Now this is where I said before, you'd want your geometry to be absolutely perfect. So literally right where the toe meets the ground. In this case, that doesn't exist. You can experiment with putting it up here where it meets the ground. So probably like it should meet here. But my experience as animators will tend to expect when they have the foot zeroed out that they're on that level ground plane. Same thing with the heel. Again, you can see here I can't do it because the heel is through the ground, so I'm just going to cheat and choose the actual ground plane. I'll show you what issues this causes later. Ideally, the geometry would be flat. I should also double check from the top view that we're actually on the furthest point out of the heel. Pretty tough to see, but I can always hide my mesh that I don't need to be looking at right now. So here I can hide all this mesh by selecting it in the outliner, pressing Control H for hide, and then quickly I can go ahead and make sure that I'm really at the furthest point back on the heel over here. I guess, and then for the ankle I'll keep that straight. For the toe, I'll keep it the furthest point out here in the toe. And then I'll average that out with this ball of the foot. So the ball of the foot, I want to try to keep it somewhat centered. Now the ball of the foot is going to end up being where your foot bends. And I get different results with this. In most rigging systems I've used, I prefer the ball to be on the ground as well. So it's rotating from back here, this point. You might want to play around with seeing how it looks from the middle. I've gotten good results both ways. So see what works best for you. I'm going to go ahead and try the bottom. And again, it's something I can easily adjust later on. Oops, don't want to do that. Again, don't rotate your joints if you can avoid it. There we go. So I'm just going to try to get this right on the grid. Should be right there. I can switch over to world mode. So now I can slide this back and forth into the point where I want the shoe to fold, which would be right about here. The pinky and the big toe are where you're going to be able to bank the foot from left to right. So what I generally want to do here, it's generally going to be to the side of the ball, but you really want to look for kind of the furthest point out on the shoe. So here, I'll put my pinky toe right about here on the furthest point out of the shoe. And then the big toe, the same thing. So the furthest point out of the shoe is right there. Now, it might be that the shoe from the front view curves a bit, in which case that means, and it does, in which case I'd want to cheat this in a little bit, right about in here somewhere, so as the foot rolls over on the side, the mesh doesn't go right through the ground. So probably somewhere right in here would give me the best results. Again, something you're going to want to experiment with. This one's a little bit more difficult. You see there's a big space in here. This is where it connects, but that'd only give you about 15 degrees to rotate the foot if you put it there. So I'm going to go ahead and cheat this out. Again, while it's nice to kind of cheat the bottom of your foot and make it a little bit flatter than you would normally so that rigging can be a little tighter. But an animator can always compensate. It's just nice to make their job easier when you can. All right, so the foot is placed and ready to go. As I mentioned, I'm going to save a lot as I go through this. So I'm going to choose, press Control-Shift-H to unhide what I last hid. It's a great trick. So it just unhides whatever I hid last. I'm going to choose Save. And for this one, I'll just choose Body Rig 02. If you want, you could also say Body Rig, leg done, foot done, but it's fine. Here, I'm going to work my way up the body. A nice thing to note here is, of course, on a normal skeleton, we don't have a side view here, sorry. The skeleton has a sort of an S curve to the spine. We can kind of see this here as it curves forward, back, and then up into the neck. Don't do this when you rig. This is one of those times when following human anatomy directly is not a good plan. You tend to find that if it curves one way here and another way here, when the animator wants to rotate the whole body forward, the joints aren't confused, but they operate better if they're more in a straight line going forward or back, not some pointing forward and some pointing backwards. So that's just my experience. If you're I'm working on my 2017. It might be that later on this changes, but I doubt it. So here, I'm just going to get my my chest about where I want it, which would be sort of towards the middle of the chest. Of course, in actual anatomy, let's pull this back up again. The spine is more towards the back of the body, which will produce more realistic rotations, but it tends to create more problems in the mesh up here in the chest, unless you're going to put in a lot of pieces there to hold the skin and make it move correctly, like an actual rib cage. So here, if you're not going to put in helper nodes there or plan to put in blend shapes, it's a little smarter to go ahead and cheat more towards the middle, find a balance point in there where you'll get realistic rotations, but you won't get tons of problems with the skin up here. And then I'm just going to average out this one here in the middle to be somewhere in the middle of these two guys, but again, more in a straight line than that typical S curve that we're used to seeing. With real human anatomy. You'll notice that Advanced Skeleton will automatically keep these joints centered. You actually can't move them left and right. This is on purpose. There's a lock in here somewhere. I forget where it is, a lock middle. You can turn that off if that's not what you want, but typically that's exactly what you want. So I'm going to leave that there. You want your spine joints to be equally spaced as well as you can. So I can probably lower that. So chest, let's see here. Chest should be kind of towards the lower part of the pectorals, or kind of right around where the nipples would be. Tends to produce a pretty good result. And this one here, again, averaged out between the two. I press insert so I can slide it separately. The base of the neck, I'll work my way up, should be the base of the neck. So right here, we're looking at right about in here, produces pretty good results. Again, something you're probably gonna need to play with. And then the head, this is one that a lot of people mess up, but your head actually rotates from right here, kind of just below the ear, going back to our anatomy drawings. You can see it's best from the side. So you can see, you can picture the ear right up here. If you draw a line out from the eye, you can see that the neck actually connects all the way up in here, and that's where our head and skull rotate from. So that's where we want to connect to. This will definitely create a weird rotation if you don't do this correctly. This is one you want to be anatomically correct as you can. If you have a more cartoony character that's just essentially a sphere stuck on a little pipe for a neck, then put it right where the sphere and the neck meet. These joints for the jaw, I've gotten different results with this. Ultimately, we're not going to use it anyway because we're going to use the head, the face rigging, which disregards this joint. But if you were doing this anatomically correct, which I'd usually recommend, the jaw rotates from just in front of the ear, right about here. And then normally, of course, then the jawbone is this one piece. Here, where you place this, whether it goes in the jaw or the mouth, doesn't really matter as long as it's hinging from back here. And again, it won't matter for us since ultimately that's not how we're going to be skinning it anyway. For the eye controls, you do want to get these spot on. You can either do it, by eye, trying to get this first one on center. This one's ultimately going to end up right through the front of the eye. You want to make sure this is correct in every view. So if I come up here, you'll see that this is not centered here. And it becomes tough because most characters don't have their eyes are usually at an angle, as you can kind of see here. They sort of point out. It's pretty tough to see. I'll hide everything but the eyes so you guys can see it better. Let's see here. Grab all these. Deselect the eyes and we'll hide. Oh, I hid the head group too. There we go. So you can see that the eyes are kind of at an angle, which makes it a little bit harder to center this. And this is where I mentioned before, I have locators to make this job a lot easier. I can actually literally hide the eyeballs too. And here's where I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to import some locators. Now, as I mentioned, if you're going to try something a little bit outside of the advanced skeleton setup, it's a good idea to save first, just in case it doesn't like it and you end up having to start back from ground zero. So here, I saved it out. I'll choose import. I have this eye locators here. I'm going to go ahead and bring these in. They're hidden. I'll unhide them by pressing Shift H. So this tells me exactly the center of my eyes. The nice thing here is either by, now doing this by eye is much easier. I can just zoom in here and get the smack on the center of the locator. If you know how to do snapping, even easier, I can literally just snap it on there and I'm done in seconds. I'll make these eye locators available for you guys too to make your job a little bit easier. You can also You could also snap this to the to this line here. Oh, it doesn't consider that an edge. It doesn't matter anyway since the eye is not pointing straight forward, so I'll show that as I unhide these. Just to keep Advanced Skeleton happy, I'm going to delete those locators I just brought in, and just remember not to move this now that I have it placed. So I'll bring my eyeballs back just by themselves. And now I just want to place this one right in the middle of the iris. That's actually easiest to do first from here. I can actually see where it is and get it right on. So I'm going to zoom in there. The closer you get this to correct, the better it'll be. So I'm just zooming in here. You can use your right mouse button and Alt to zoom in. You can also hold in Control, Alt, and left mouse button to do a drag window, and it'll zoom into that exact window, which I found a lot of people asking me about. I guess I could snap onto point here too, but this is fine. Okay, and then I'll double check from my top view to make sure it's sitting on the front of the iris. It's not. So I'll move it straight back until it lines up. That should keep its placement just right. So there we go. Let me double check. And again, make sure that it's still sitting right in the middle of the iris. It is. So, so this one's perfectly centered. This one's smack in the middle of the iris. We are good to go. So the eye is set up. Again, since I don't want to do that again, I'm going to go ahead and save that out. It's a good general rule is if you do something you don't want to have to repeat, save. And save as a new version. You can also turn on an autosaver. Not a bad idea. It just means you can't save different names. Okay, let's go ahead and work into the arm. What I usually like to do here, the clavicle doesn't matter right now. It's mostly the shoulder that we really want to get correct. So I will unhide all these things by selecting them in the outliner, pressing Shift-H. Gonna go grab my shoulder. Forgot to mention, by the way, Advanced Skeleton does a nice thing by naming these. That's not normal to see a name above a joint. So it's really cool that that's added in. It makes it easier to see where things should be placed. Now the shoulder is a weird one. It's hard to get perfect. You're never going to get perfect rotations or movements on the shoulder because there's so many muscle systems working here to create the right movement in the skin. So we're going to cheat this. We're going to cheat it in two ways. If you were to do a really serious high-end rig, you would actually put the shoulder where it's supposed to go. I'll pull up my anatomy here. You can see the shoulder's rotating. Actually, this is pretty close to where we're going to put it. You basically are looking for the rounded part of the shoulder here. You know, even though the shoulder bone's up here, it's sitting a little bit lower. So kind of towards the top of the shoulder, and kind of you're looking for that radius and sort of aiming kind of in the middle of it. If you're going to cheat one way or the other, it's better to cheat out towards the shoulder than cheat back and towards the body. That'll create weird folding in here. So whenever in doubt, it's best to start with where it should be in an anatomically correct skeleton, and then work your way towards something more more balanced for your abstracted model as things don't move the way you want them to. So here you can even see this shoulder isn't really rounded like a normal shoulder, partly because this arm is straight. So I'm going to guess that right around in here is going to be, if this shoulder were down, would be kind of in that radius. Again, if you get too high, you can get lots of weird folding down here. And if you get too low, you can get lots of weird folding up top. So if you're ever unsure, better to put it towards the middle of the mesh, even though a real shoulder is a little bit higher. In this case, though, I need these things to be planar, just like we did with the leg. So I'm going to actually try to get my wrist and my elbow in the middle of the skeleton, or the middle of the arm. So right about here should produce pretty good results for the whole arm. If you have a good modeler, they should have already tried to get the arm nice and straight. It'll make your job easier on the rigging. Although a good rigger should be able to accommodate almost any orientation of the arm. And if you need to, if your rig has an arm that's pointed down, which actually is a little bit nicer to skin, you can just rotate the whole thing together. Again, you want to try to keep these bones in a line. So I'm going to start with the shoulder right there. We'll see how we do. Again, if you have to cheat in one direction, better to cheat out a little bit than cheat in towards the body. You'll tend to get better results. I'm going to go ahead and do the elbow and then the wrist. So the elbow, again, it's fine if you're at an angle in this direction, but you can only be at an angle in one of the directions, and you're always going to want to have the elbow angled back a little bit, just so the IK knows which way to solve itself. So I'll aim for right about in the middle here. We can see where the elbow rotates. Well, I find with this model, the elbow folds right there, but from this view, the elbow looks better if it folds a little bit ahead of that. So kind of right in here feels a little more natural. For me at least, my elbow, my actual arm, folds more from the wider part of the arm rather than from this narrow part here. And I tend to find that if I do this rig with the joint here, it looks a little strange. So I'll cheat it kind of in the middle of those two. Again, you can change it later if you need to. Oops. I made the mistake of going up. I don't want this to go up. Oh, I'm sorry, that's fine. We're in the front view. So I don't want to go up here. That would suddenly make this whole thing non-planar because it's already got an angle in the top view. So right about there. And then the wrist is a little bit easier. So you're kind of looking for this transition point between the arm and the hand, which puts us right about here. Again, right in the middle. And then from this view, this should already be centered. Oops, it's not because I moved this up. Yeah, remember you want to keep this all in a line to keep these planar. So that's about what I want. So nice straight line. Yes, the wrist is a little higher, the elbow's a little bit lower. You're basically trying to compensate and find a happy medium. If the wrist doesn't bend right, it'll be pretty obvious. If you need to bend up a little bit, you could probably get away with it, but you're going to start to get weird rotations on the elbow, so just be prepped for it. It's better to have that elbow planar, and I'm going to stick to it. Alright, so wrist is placed. Now we didn't do the clavicle, so I'm going to go back and do that. And also I noticed my shoulder is way off here, so I'm going to press insert, and get my shoulder, insert and get my shoulder in the middle of the shoulder, which should be right about here. At this point, it might actually be helpful to jump into my perspective view and try to look at it there. This is one of those times when it might be more helpful to go to your normal shaded mode, choose X-ray, and try to look at the mass here as you're trying to approximate it. So about like that. Turn off X-ray, back to template. All right. Now I placed my clavicle last. My personal preference is to actually do the clavicle correctly, where it is anatomically. Oops, wrong button. My apologies. So here, if you see the clavicle right here, the collarbone connects to the top of the shoulder over here, and hinges from right here, and you can actually feel on your chest, right at the base of your throat, where that connects. So this is where you want to rotate from for a normal shrug, either forward, back, up, or down. So that I actually want to get correct. So I'll do from this view first. Now this one does not have to be planar, so I'm just going to hit insert again so it's moving without moving the rest of the joints I just placed. So we're looking at probably right about here, just off to the side where those bones connect. And then from the front view, it actually does connect a little bit farther forward, not just beneath the skin, but probably a little bit farther back from right in there, but not in a perfect line with everything. That'll create some weirdness as well. Again, you'll notice it tends to be easier to fold your shoulders forward than it does back, so it's not necessary to have it kind of in the center so that back looks as good as forward. We want the forward to look correct. So that's actually pretty good right there. Okay, and you'll notice just like we see in the skeleton, the base of the neck is just above the collarbone, and we're pretty close to that too from my initial placement for the base of the neck. So we're doing good. We're to the last part here, which ultimately is the hand. To be safe, I'll save again. And now I'll place the hand. Now the hand definitely takes some time. There's a lot of joints here, so just sit down, get comfortable, get ready. and work your way through it one bit at a time. So a good thing to do is just place the joints of the finger first. So note that, just gonna make a little room here so you can see what we're doing. Note that, actually I guess this would be easier in this view, non-templated. So note that while your finger, we have the finger, the little V here in between the fingers, stop right here. The fingers actually, your knuckles are right back here, right across here, and that's the base of each finger rotates from. So that's good to keep in mind, whether your character is cartoony or not. If you don't have it there, it's going to look really weird if your finger actually rotates from too far forward. Your thumb is also kind of weird. It's sort of a giant mega finger, if you want to think of it that way. We have a joint right about here. We have a joint right here. And then the last joint is actually way back in here. So you can actually see it on our anatomy. I'm zooming in here kind of in an ugly way. But you can actually see here your fingers fold from right here, but your thumb folds from all the way back here just in front of the wrist, where the other fingers actually connect. So that makes that one a little bit special and a little different one to pay attention to. So let's keep that in mind. Otherwise, I've seen some really bad hand rotations, and something that immediately is obvious when you're animating that something's off when it moves or when you're posing it. So again, for each one of my fingers, I'm just going to line it up with about where the knuckle would be. This is the one time I'll rotate. I'll go ahead and rotate, unless of course I do it with the arms or legs. I'll rotate these in place. I'm just going to do them all in one view first, and then I'll rotate in the other view as well. So again, the knuckle should be right about here. I'll rotate in place, working my way through. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video and finish this up. Right, my hand joints are placed. And now for the thumb joint. For the thumb joint, this one you're going to have to do a little more freehand, but I always start with the thumb about where it should be, so it's going to rotate from right about here. Again, kind of aiming for the middle of the mesh. From the other view, I'm just going to switch over to perspective view. This is one of those times when actually that X-ray mode might work to your advantage. If you switch over, I guess I can just keep that on. Might make it a little bit easier to see when you're in the middle of the skin. But it's never totally easy, so that's pretty good actually. But the important thing here is if I switch to rotate, you'll notice that get the X-ray off. You'll notice the thumb actually will rotate naturally in this direction here, but yet if you look at the joint, it's rotating on this axis, which is pretty odd. I want these two to line up. So I'm actually going to go ahead and rotate this one on this axis as well. Normally these are things that you would not want to do with your joints, but in this case, this will create a nicer looking joint. And I'll rotate that down so it's more in the middle of the skin. So right around there. Maybe lower that a little bit. Again, pretty tough to see, but once you get used to it, you'll be able to work it out. And then this is probably the hardest part of the rigging. So you'll notice now that that joint, the system of joints, now rotate in the same axis as the thumb, and we'll get a nice smooth rotation on there. You notice that these are sticking out, so I'm going to go ahead here just while I'm at it. Well, actually, maybe I won't. I'd say normally what I do is I go ahead and rotate these down to line up with the actual finger, but it almost doesn't make sense just because I'm going to be changing the location of each one of these joints in just a second. So, and I'm going to do it from the top view. So here's my preferred method. I'm going to switch over to template mode. I'm just going to work through my joints and take each one, moving it to where it should be. So now it's pretty tough to see in this view, just because of the actual sculpt. It doesn't have a lot of definition on the hand. This is where a really well-defined hand will make this job easier. I'm just going to use the arrow keys to drop down to the next joint level, and then the last one goes at the end. If you need to fix joints, of course, you can go back to insert mode. Try to keep these in line as you work. It'll make for a nicer folding joint as you go. So I'd work through each one of these, doing this sort of the same system, trying to find the right place in the fingers. In this case, again, sorry about the screaming child in the background. Having a rough morning. So, you can also check from the perspective view to see if you're lining up correctly with the right points in the skin. You can sometimes see them a little bit better here. So for example, you can see this joint a little bit better from this angle, which helps you kind of line up, but I did a pretty good job guessing. What I like to do is when I'm done doing it from the top view, I'll switch to this view. Instead of rotating down for this, I'm going to go ahead and just grab each joint and actually place it in the middle of the skin. Again, you can use X-ray if you want. In this case, actually, it's a little bit easier without it because the joints are about the same size as the skin. So I can actually see when they come through. So right about here, and then the last one I like to put just on the tip of the finger, kind of in line with the other joint. So right about there. And again, for that one, I just use the arrow keys up and down, moving through here. So I don't have to select each joint. It makes it a little bit faster just to tweak these out. And it makes sense to get these as close as you possibly can so your fingers move nicely. Also, it's going to flip it to the other side. So if you do nice work on this side, it halves your work for the other side. So this is the slowest part by far. I'm going to go ahead and stop it here, and I'll pause it for a second, and we'll come back when I do the thumb. I'll come back just a hair earlier just to point out, as I do the last finger, that as I move these down into place, I've already placed them correctly from the top view, so these are exactly where I want, right along the joints. When I do it in this view, it's really important that you grab that the Y arrow and lock it to the axis as you move it straight down. If you just do it freehand, you're just as likely to move it away from where you want in the top view, and then you have to go back and forth, back and forth. If you didn't reset the manipulator preference like I did before, the nice thing is, if you didn't do that, when you use the arrow keys and you go to the next joint, it'll remember the last thing you had selected and keep that Y axis selected, which is kind of nice, but only in this type of situation. Everywhere else, it drives me bananas. All right, so now we got to do the thumb joint. Just make sure it's lined up. So I'll go back over here. So we have this one already correct. So we did first. We have the rotation correct, so I don't need to play with that. The next joint is kind of right here in this rounded part of the thumb. The next joint is right here in this bend of the thumb. And you'll definitely find here that this thumb is not going to be straight. That's just the way the thumb is. It has a natural bend to it that you're not going to sculpt around, but it tends not to create significant issues, too many significant issues when you're rigging or when you're animating. My preference, though, is for a model to have a fairly straight thumb, and then for the animator to pose the thumb with the proper bend. It creates better deformations. So again, that's right now from the top view, but not from the side view. So here, because the thumb is separate from the rest of them, it's a little bit easier to see. I'm just going to again grab that Y-axis, use the down arrow key to move through the joints, and then line these up until I'm just right. So now we're right in the middle of the thumb, and again, going back here, you can see the rotation axis is actually a little bit off. There we go. So that's a little bit better. All right. So there's the hand all placed. Elbow, shoulder, the whole deal, clavicle. This is my best guess for everything. It might be off a little bit. I will find out later. So that's the great thing about Advanced Skeleton. We get to try it out and see how we did. So let me save this out again just to be safe. You definitely want to save before you do your first round of the rigging. I'll put something else in there so I know it's an important point. Maybe I'll do, that's fine. I'll just remember 6. All right, and now here are the magic. So if you're wondering what all these other things do, there's some cool functions in here. I guess I should point out before I show the magic. No, I'll do the magic first. At this point, if I go down here to the build section, I can go ahead and do my build advanced skeleton. When you click this, it looks like maybe nothing's happening, but if you see it, look at the mouse, it's kind of flickering around, and you'll see it's actually doing a lot of calculations here. You'll see these bones flickering around, and then you'll see controls pop up. It's doing a ton of calculations here. So there we go, done. So it just did in about 15 seconds, maybe less, probably less, what it takes normally to many, many hours to set up, even if you have all the bones there. So while the bones thing seems kind of frustrating and slow, that's nothing compared to actually setting up all these control rigs And if you've never done this before, you're looking at, that just probably saved you right there a couple weeks worth of work. This is a fully functioning rig at this point. The rig does everything you need it to. It has full IK, FK, and the arms. You have controls for everything there. But what we really want to do is see how well it works with the joint placement we just had. So to make this work just right now, we would want to go ahead and do a quick skinning and just see if the deformations the joints are rotating from the right place. I'll do that in just a second. I'll go ahead and do it now. So I'm going to jump down into the skinning menu here. We'll come back to the fit menu to show you a couple other cool functions, but for right now, we need to see that skinning. Now, the fastest skinning method right here, there's 4 of them, is just to choose this option 1, which will go ahead and do a default basic Maya skinning. Nothing fancy here at all, and you'll see just how unfancy it is in a second. What this requires you to do, you can read it. It says select objects to deform, which in this case is going to be everything. So I'll select all objects. It probably doesn't matter if you select the group, but I'm going to avoid it just because you can't actually deform groups. So let's grab all the mesh. This includes the eyes. Don't worry, this is going to be replaced later anyway. I'll select deform joints button, which automatically selects all the correct joints. Set smooth bind options, which just brings up the actual standard Maya menu. If you haven't been using this or don't know what you're doing, just go ahead and hit edit reset. My one recommendation is knock down your max influences to 3. It'll make it a little bit easier to paint weights later on if you need to do some fix up, which you typically do. So I'll hit apply. At this point, you could test this out. It's not going to look too pretty. So I still have this on reference mode so I don't accidentally select the mesh. But if you grab, say, the foot control, move it, you'll see lots of crazy skinning thing going on here. And this is typically what happens whenever you do a normal skinning in Maya. That's just how things normally skin. You get bad bends, bad elbows, bad everything, and the wrong skin mushing. Well, that leads me to the next thing. The wrong skin moving when it's not supposed to. So we're going to add another skinning option here called the Delta Mush, which is pretty fantastic. The Delta Mush basically does a fast sort of deformation skinning on this whole thing all at once and does a pretty amazing job of making this look great without any effort whatsoever. This is great for doing a quick test of our rig and seeing if we like how it functions. So to do this operation, all we need to do is select our objects, which in this case, of course, again, will be everything, minus the group. I hit Control to deselect that. You hit Harden Weights, which apparently makes this look nicer. I don't actually know what it's doing. I'm not familiar with the Delta Mush. While this will take a minute, while it's doing this, I'll mention there's 2 versions of Delta Mush. I think there is one embedded in Maya, which is what it's using. Or if you prefer, you can use WB Delta Mush, which is a plugin made by Weber Huang, which I'm guessing probably does a better job. I'm not sure, or a different job. I haven't used it. I should probably be trying it out. But for what we're doing right now, it doesn't really matter. So now the hardened weights are finished. I can see it's not calculating. I can hit Apply Delta Mush. It takes half a second. And then we are ready to try it out. At this point, you can click on things and you'll see that right away they're looking pretty impressive for almost no effort. You get even nice adjustments in the pants. You get normal folds back here. You might get some funkiness. Like here we have multiple pieces of clothing. You might get some weirdness there. But for the most part, your rig works. For a lot of productions, you could probably start animating right now and be pretty happy with the results. You'll see things that here need to be tweaked out, but this is all pretty normal stuff. That again probably just saved us another week or so worth of skin weighting. You will notice, in this case actually the head control's lost up in here. If the controls aren't placed right, don't worry, those are easy to fix up later. I'll show you how. So here's that head control. You will notice that some things really don't work right. So here you'll see some really kind of funky floating on the chin. It might even be worse in your model depending on where you put the jaw. Don't sweat that. When we do the facial rig, it'll fix it. If you don't do the facial rig, you need to paint those weights onto the head, which is about a 10-second operation. I guess I'll show it to you too, just to show you guys how that works. But that's a really easy thing to fix, and that's typically how you're normally getting skin to work. So don't fret. You just saved yourself so much time. Now here is the really cool thing about the rig. If you like how everything works, at this point you have a body rig ready to go. You could animate. You do want to go through everything, especially around those shoulders. Make sure that you're happy, not necessarily with the way the skin folds, but to make sure that you're happy with where it's rotating from. So actually looking at here, to me, watching this, it looks like actually that joint is a little bit, it's probably a little bit low, but I might have to just deal with that so that the wrist and elbow work. But to me, it feels like it's a little far out. I want to be rotating from a little bit more inside the body, so I'm going to update that. I want to check things like that elbow, see how that feels to me. That also feels like it's folding a little far back, but I do like the way it's holding the elbow. So I might want to move that out a little bit. The wrist is another one that's easy kind of to get weird rotation, weird movement on, but actually that looks pretty good. I can go down through the fingers, the whole deal, make sure I like it. Actually, a good way to test those out is use this thing here. You can do just the curl all at once. But actually, that feels pretty natural, aside from when I do that. Check the knees, check the ankle. Make sure these things rotate in a way that to you feels like it makes sense. So it feels natural for your character, whatever their design is. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all the controls of the character. You can play with that on your own. But I'm actually pretty happy with this, with the exception of the shoulder, which is great because it allows me to show you one of the best functions for advanced skeleton and something you just cannot do when you're doing this by yourself. So this is a pretty phenomenal use. Advanced skeleton will allow you to go back to our build and fit section and make changes, and it will still allow you to keep the skinning while you're doing this, and it doesn't create any problems whatsoever. Normally this is a huge hassle when you're doing it yourself. Here, no problem at all. So the way this works is we're going to go back to our build section. I'm going to hit toggle fit advanced. This will actually revert me back to this rig here, the one that I originally placed, and allow me to make any changes I want. So everything should still be placed correctly. It looks like it moved a little bit, which is a little odd. It sure did. So I might have to do a little correction there. And I want to, that's the first time I've seen that actually, so that's a little interesting. So yeah, it looks like my wrist moved, maybe my elbow too. So I'm going to actually grab my shoulder. I'm not sure if I did this by mistake at one point or if it did this. I want to get this right back in there. All right. And I mentioned that I think I want the shoulder in a little bit. So I'll hit insert and pull this in. That's going to create some not as good deformations down here, but I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit for that shoulder to look right. So we're going to do this. Now, whatever changes you make here, you need to go through and hit update now, which this could actually have been the source of my previous issue. I forgot to hit update before building the skeleton. Now, there's two options here. It defaults to not being in fit mode, which means you have to hit update, which will take a second. It'll go through, it will actually reorient all the joints and make them line up just right. It'll zero out all the placements, so it's now good to go. So that takes a few seconds to do. If you hit fit mode while you're working on the skeleton, it'll update each joint as you, and its hierarchy as you make changes. But I find this is kind of slow to work in that mode. So I prefer just to make all my changes and hit update now. The risk is, like I just did, you'll forget to do it, and your joints won't actually reorient correctly. Whenever you're done though, you hit toggle fit advanced, and basically it's going to, oh, I already did that, sorry. You hit rebuild advanced skeleton, it'll rebuild. Oh, it's telling me that I'm not in the build pose. Because I moved everything. Hold on. So just pause for a second to check out what's happening. And honestly, I don't know what just happened. I was worried that the skinning might have caused an issue. But I just went back and I made the changes again. And did the update just like I showed you guys. And then did the rebuild and it worked just fine. So, which is what it's supposed to do. So you'll see now that the joints are in a new place here. They're actually where they should have been. The shoulder's in a little bit. The elbow, actually I forgot to move the elbow. Again, not hard to change. And then the skinning should still be in place. So if I were to switch over, I should just be able to still grab my skin and move and check things out. And see if I prefer my new shoulder placement. I do like that better. So even though there's more movement down here, to me that feels more like what I expect that shoulder to move like. So that's a good thing. So basically at this point, the process is going through, checking each rotation and making sure you like how it feels. If you don't like how it feels, don't worry about improper skin deformations too much. It's mostly about rotation points. Go back in, you do the same operation, you toggle back to the fit skeleton, you make your changes, you hit update, rebuild as many times as you like until you get the actual rig working the way you want it to. It's a really awesome system and great, especially when you're starting out trying to figure out where the best placement of each of these joints are, especially in the elbows, shoulders, wrists, kind of everywhere, the spine, the head, all these things. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and save it out because I know I'm getting close to something I do like. Assuming you like what you have, I'll probably go back and make a few changes later. We would now go through the rest of the system, which I'll show you, to clean up and get this thing ready to animate. Now, before I go into talking about the different options for skinning, I should mention one other thing here back in the fit section, which is kind of cool and may be of use to some of you. While you're putting your bones in there's this option here for display. If you click on this checkbox here, it'll create geometry that matches the length and size of each one of your joints here, and kind of allows you to sort of figure out where things should be going. I find it works out. It's fairly helpful. The best thing about it is it creates these planes that actually show you how planar your leg is. You can see how this is actually right where my knee control ends up. Same thing back here. It's right where my elbow control would end up for an IK system. So it kind of helps you let you know how well you got your joints to be planar. You can also switch between cylinders or boxes or pretty cool bones to see how things are looking in the actual skeleton or in the actual placement inside your mesh. So a pretty cool thing. The one thing I do notice is if I try to get rid of the geometry, it does keep the planes. I don't know why. I'm guessing it's a bug, but not a big deal. Once you go to again your update now and do your build, that all disappears. So I'll do that again just to make it go away. But a nice function when you're trying to figure out where things go, and again, maybe perhaps less aware of how the skeleton should look. Still rebuilding. I'll pause while I do this part. It's also worth noting, I think I mentioned before, but if you don't like the placement or size or shape of your controls, these are all things you can change later on in this. The clavicles, because of how I place them way inside here, they're oriented a little funky, but basically indicates to me that the programmer felt like the clavicles should have been somewhere else, but this is where, as an animator, where I prefer them. So going on into the deform section, now we did a really fast skinning with that option 1 followed by the delta mush. This is naturally going to create an imperfect skin, But for the fast, the person that just needs stuff done and done now, it's pretty hard to beat. But you'll notice things like if you look at the fingers and here, like looking at how this curves, it doesn't retain the rigidity of a knuckle like it should, even though our joint's placed correctly. Might be a little far back. But really that comes down to the fact that we're just asking a lot from the system. We're asking for it to recognize and perfect something that we didn't really have much control over. That's just the nature of a fast skinning like we did. It's pretty amazing that it works this well. The truth is you need to go back there and use standard skin paint weighting to get this just right, or try one of these other options. So the other options here for skinning, there's a skin cage, which basically it's a pretty cool system. You basically create the cage, and it brings in a whole system of boxes that allows you to choose the size and volume and placement of each body part according to your character. And then it copies the weights over from those boxes to the actual mesh. Does a pretty nice job, actually. And there's different options there to sort of create better looking skinning. In the past, that's what I've used to actually do my final skinning. But the Delta Mush is actually a new thing that gets me pretty close pretty fast for a faster job. The sub wrap creates sort of deformers that do the same sort of thing. And then the skin loops is probably one of the best options. It actually allows you to choose a specific loop on the body. So for example, you can say, I want the elbow to fold from right here, and it will make a bend right there, and it does a really nice job there too. But it requires that your geometry be totally solid, your loops be totally solid. You have great edge loops across the board, which you'd want anyway, but you might find that you don't have exactly what you need when you're trying to do this method. So it requires really good mesh. These other options here, the geometry, skeleton, polyboxes, mannequin, this allows you to create additional low-res geometry, which you can put on a separate layer. And then your animators can use this to animate if your mesh is too heavy, to make animation a little faster. If you're going to do something like this, my recommendation, of course, as always, is to save this out. Since we're coming up on the end, I tell you to say, body rig finished 1, so we know it's a new stage, and then you can go ahead and create some of these new things. I'll do this in a second, but the other options here, the control curves allow you to actually create a new curve, one that you prefer. You can import them in, you can swap the curve out, you can do whatever you want, and it will fix it for you. Change scale, the whole deal. It's actually some really, really great functions in here. Set colors, whatever you want. Most auto riggers I've seen don't allow you to change the controls just because it's too annoying for them to set up, but this allows you to do whatever you want. Control mesh is a really neat idea that for my computer hasn't worked because my computer just isn't fast enough, but maybe on yours it would work. Basically what this does is you just click on control, you click on create control mesh. It'll actually basically use the mesh of the character to create a new control, and allows you to basically hide all the controls, and instead of clicking on those normal controls, you can click directly on the body that you want to move and then move it. The nice thing is it's really intuitive. You just click what you want to move and move it. The downside is that there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that make it run really slow. For my computer, so slow it's not worth doing, but it's a really cool idea, fun to play with, and of course easy to delete if it doesn't work. The partial joints, you can add in additional joints for where you want to get more control over your mesh. So here we could add another bone in here to get a better elbow, or add another bone for the shoulder, or for the chest, for the stomach. This just gives you more control to tweak out the skeleton, make the mesh move the way you want it to. Same thing, I believe, with the joint groups. I haven't really used those either. So again, I'm using this just to pump out skeletons rigs as fast as I can. So I'm not worried about noodling it, but the great thing is that you can if you want to. If you do want to create the low poly, there's the 3 options for it. A skeleton, which is actually a skeleton. I find that to be less useful, even though it's super cool looking. The poly boxes are probably the most useful if you create it. So I'll go ahead and create one. It'll take a minute, but it'll throw in poly boxes for the whole character. Basically trying to guess your volumes. If I'm not mistaken, you can go ahead and scale these things and make them actually, approximate the size of your character. So you can actually get this to feel more like your mesh. I'm not sure how much you can move them. I haven't done a lot of this. But the idea is once you create it and mirror it over, I guess I should read it before I talk about it on a tutorial. There's a way to basically attach it to your skeleton and then use it as a low poly rig. For me, it's so low poly, it's not that useful unless you just need things to run at full frame rates. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit delete. But it's a way to get a fake mannequin in there, or a low poly mannequin in there. You can also do this here. Create the mannequin, which actually creates a traditional mannequin, but again, not so useful for as far as I'm concerned. But a nice idea. It might be better in this case for you to make your own low poly one and attach it yourself. But these are other options for you to work with. So at this point, I am nearing the finish of my body rig. I'm feeling pretty good about where everything's placed. I like my control setup. Now the one thing, just to show you how to move controls you don't like, so for example my head and my clavicle controls, actually maybe I'll start with the head control. So it doesn't really matter, but here, to do the head control, I grab my CVs right here. I'm sorry, what you want to make sure you do is select the control vertices of your curves. They have control vertices, not vertices, but that's because they're made out of NURBS curves. Grab your control vertices. You can do whatever you want with this. What you don't want to do is you don't want to grab the actual control itself and try to scale it or translate it. Obviously, you'll be moving the joints it's attached to. So, but if you grab the control vertices that make it up, you can do whatever you want. So here, I typically like my control to be out and back of the head. Let's see here, I'll use my grid to rotate this where I want. So somewhere out back in here, you can also scale them out. You can do whatever you want with those points that feels correct to you. The nice thing is, no matter what you do, it doesn't change the rotation point. It doesn't change how it functions. It just changes where it sits. So that's a cool thing. So the clavicles, you notice, kind of got a little messy in there. So to fix those up, what I'm going to do is just slide them over, and I'll show you how to mirror them over. One thing I forgot to mention, I did choose show and turned off joints. If the joints are in here when you're trying to select CVs, it's going to select the joints first, which gets really frustrating. So turning the joints off temporarily, so that when you grab a control and grab those CVs, it's only grabbing those CVs. It makes your job a little bit nicer, a little bit easier. So here, just going to go ahead and kind of square this up a little bit so it looks a little bit nicer. I'm going to pull it out so it's easier to grab and scale it down. Maybe get it back over the shoulders a little bit. So that's a nicer placement of the control as far as I'm concerned. Make it a little bit fatter. Or not, maybe just to save time. And then the shoulder, of course, is right on top of that, so I want to get that shoulder control out. So I'll slide this out kind of over the side of the shoulder to make it easier to see. I can scale it down a little bit so it's not as clunky in there. Now the nice thing here is Advanced Skeleton gives you the options to mirror the controls, the changes you make, so you don't have to do it all over again. So over here, under this control curves, yes, you can swap in a new curve that you make. You can also just hit right to left, and it'll automatically do any changes from here over to the other side. You're good to go. So I go through the whole thing and make any changes that I want. You can do things like change color and stuff like that too, which is also nice. One thing I should mention, you'll notice there's some controls lost in here. There's one for the jaw. which does a lot of crazy manipulations. That's because we didn't tell it what to skin to. So that's something you have to paint yourself if you're going to stop here. Same thing with the eyes. It moves a lot of mesh around. It shouldn't. But since we're going to be doing the inboard facial control system next, I'm not going to bother with that. It'll replace all of it and do a much better job anyway. So to finish up, we just need to go through here, and we're going to do a few last options just to make sure the thing it's clean and ready to go. Again, as always, I'm going to save a new version out before I do this, just in case anything weird happens, or if I made a mistake somehow. I don't want to be stuck and having to go back to the beginning. So I'm going to jump down here to display. We'll go over these tools later. Under motion system, this is the controls. So this is something we do not want to hide. Keep that open. But joints and joint axes, we don't want anyone to click on. So let's get rid of those. So they're still in there, but you just don't want anyone to see them. You can also select the joint layer and make options to here directly. And some people like to put it on a separate layer over here, but I'm just going to leave it like this. It's probably the safest. And then under optimize, I'm going to go through all these options and get rid of the stuff that we don't need. So delete unused nodes, remove unused influences. Those two go pretty fast. Prune clusters also goes pretty fast for me. Delete saved UIs, done, also fast. Note it says you have to save and reopen for the file for this to take effect. Reduced file size. It gave me an error. I'm not too worried about it. Maybe I should be. I'm not too worried about it. If I don't have a reduced file size, I'm not worried about it. This is already pretty tiny. Lastly, when you go to the publish section to finish this thing off, remember that our mesh is in a separate file from our skeleton, from our actual rig. So we want to actually marry these two things together. So going through these options, set display layers to R. So reference mode. Joint set to hidden, we already did that. We can do it again if we need to. Go to build pose, super important. You want to make sure that everything is defaulted around. If you were playing with different controls, you want to make sure they're all zeroed when you get ready to rig, otherwise it can cause lots of issues. And then finally publish. So publish will actually save out another version of this rig that actually has everything married together. So I'm going to go open up that rig. Here we go, finished 2, published. And you can make this name whatever you want. We'll open up that one instead. So this is not a fully functioning, ready to go rig. Well, we can do anything you want with this at this point, including if you want to do things like you want to go back here, you can make changes to, you could group these things together. I like to put them all under one node, tuna. So that my outliner is a little bit cleaner. If you want, you could also do things like a really common trick is to make a layer for your controls so that they're easy to hide for your animators. A quick way to do that actually is to go to the show menu, choose none, bring back your NURBS curves, select them directly, and then create a layer from selected. And I'll call this control layer. You can't put any spaces in a shelf name or in a layer name. So control layer or controls, whatever you want. I'll bring everything back. And now I can actually hide my control layer when I'm doing a play blast or when I just don't want to see it. And I can hide my mesh when I want to hide the mesh. Mostly it's just so you can reference the mesh and make sure you don't accidentally select on it, so it makes it easier to animate. So at this point, I could say this out as my publish to, whatever I want to do. I could add in anything I want from here that I'm comfortable doing as a rigger or as a modeler, animator. But the main thing is to have that default rig ready to go. This can now be animated on, and we have a fully functioning rig. Now, I spent a good hour and a half talking through that, but if you were doing this yourself without me talking in your ear, you could easily have a fully functioning body rig in less than half an hour, probably 15-20 minutes if you know exactly what you're doing. Now, the next segment we're going to do is going to be the facial rig. And I'll walk you through how to do the whole facial setup, which is optional. You don't have to do it. But if you do it, you wouldn't want to do that from the published version. You'd want to do it back here from one of the finished versions that we did before we published. So, but other than that, we have a finished rig. You can now reference this into a new scene and start working. Good luck to all of you. I look forward to seeing what rigs you come up with.